Most organizations think their AI strategy is about adoption, licenses, prompts, maybe a champion program. They are wrong. The failure mode is simpler and uglier. They're outsourcing judgment to a probabilistic system and calling it productivity. Copilot isn't a faster spreadsheet. It isn't deterministic software you control with inputs and outputs. It's a cognition engine that produces plausible text, plausible plans, plausible answers at scale. This episode is about the mindset shift, from tool adoption to cognitive collaboration. And the open loop is this: outsourced judgment scales confusion faster than capability. Tool metaphors fail because they assume determinism. Tool metaphors are comforting because they preserve the old contract between you and the system. You do a thing, the tool does the thing. If it fails, you can point to the broken part. That contract holds for most of the last 40 years of enterprise software because those systems are legible. Repeatable behavior, explainable failures, and accountability that stays attached to a human. Spreadsheets execute arithmetic, search retrieves references, automation enforces bounded rules. Even when they fail in enumerated ways you can trace, audit, and govern. Now enter Copilot and watch every one of those metaphors collapse. Copilot is not deterministic. It is not a formula engine, a retrieval system, or a rules engine. It is probabilistic synthesis. It takes context, partial signals, and patterns and produces output that looks like an answer. The output is often useful, sometimes it's wrong, often it's unprovable without doing actual work. And it is presented in the shape of certainty, fluent, structured, confident. That answer-shaped text is the trap. Humans are trained to treat coherent language as evidence of understanding. But coherence is not correctness. Fluency is not truth. Confidence is not ownership. Copilot can generate a plan that sounds like your organization, even when it has no idea what your organization will accept, tolerate, or legally survive. So when leaders apply tool-era controls to a cognition system, they don't get control, they get conditional chaos. They create prompt libraries to compensate for unclear strategy. They add guardrails that assume output is a thing they can constrain like a macro. They measure adoption like it's a new email client rollout. They treat hallucination as the primary risk, and they miss the real risk. The organization starts accepting plausible output as substituted judgment. Because once the output is in the memo, it becomes the plan. Once it's in the policy response, it becomes the answer. Once it's in the incident summary, it becomes what happened. And now the organization has scaled an artifact without scaling the responsibility behind it. This is the foundational misunderstanding. With deterministic tools, the human decides and the tool executes. With cognitive systems, the tool proposes and the human must decide. If you don't invert that relationship explicitly, Copilot becomes the silent decision maker by default. And default decisions are how enterprises accumulate security debt, compliance debt, and reputational debt. So before talking about prompts, governance, or enablement, the first job is to define what the system actually is. Because if you keep calling cognition a tool, you'll keep managing it like one, and you will keep outsourcing judgment until the organization forgets who is responsible for outcomes. Define cognitive collaboration without romance. Cognitive collaboration is the least exciting definition you can give it, which is why it's useful. It means the AI generates candidate thinking and the human supplies meaning, constraints, and final responsibility. The machine expands the option space, the human collapses it into a decision. That distinction matters because most organizations are trying to get the machine to collapse the option space for them. They want the answer. They want a single clean output they can forward, approve, and move on from. That is the old tool contract trying to survive in a new system. In architectural terms, cognitive collaboration treats Copilot as a distributed idea generator. It proposes drafts, interpretations, summaries, and plans based on whatever context you allow it to see. Sometimes that context is strong, often it's weak. Either way, the output is not truth. It is a structured possibility. The human role is not to admire the output. It is to arbitrate. Arbitration sounds like a small word, but it's a high-friction job. Choosing what matters, rejecting what doesn't, naming trade-offs, and accepting consequences. That is judgment. And if you don't make that explicit, you end up with a system that produces infinite plausible options and nobody willing to own the selection. So cognitive collaboration has 4 human responsibilities that do not disappear just because the prose looks finished. First, intent. The AI cannot invent your intent. It can mimic one. It can infer one. It can generate something that sounds like intent. But unless you explicitly name what you are trying to accomplish and what you refuse to do, the output will drift toward generic correctness instead of your actual priorities. Second, framing. Framing is where you declare the problem boundary. What question are we answering, for which audience, under which constraints, with what definition of success? Most leaders skip this because they think it's overhead. Then they wonder why the AI produces nice content that doesn't survive contact with reality. Third, veto power. This is where most programs fail quietly. They train people to get outputs, not to reject them. A veto is not an emotional reaction. It is a disciplined refusal. This claim is unsupported. This risk is unowned. This recommendation violates policy. This tone creates legal exposure. This conclusion is premature. If you cannot veto AI output, you are not collaborating, you are complying. Fourth, escalation. When the output touches a high-impact decision, the collaboration must force a human checkpoint, not a polite suggestion, a structural checkpoint. If a system can generate a plausible interpretation of a security incident or a plausible policy answer or a plausible change plan, you need an escalation path that says, this is the moment where a human must decide and a workflow must record who did. Now, why does this feel uncomfortable? Because cognitive collaboration eliminates the illusion of a single right answer that you can outsource. Deterministic tools let you pretend the right configuration produces the right result. Cognitive systems don't give you that comfort. They give you a spread of possibilities and a confidence tone. And they force you to admit the real truth of leadership. Decisions are made under uncertainty, and responsibility cannot be delegated to a text box. So let's be explicit about what cognitive collaboration is not. It is not an assistant, because assistants can be held accountable for execution quality under your direction. Copilot cannot be held accountable. It has no duty of care. It is not an oracle because it has no privileged access to truth. It has access to tokens, patterns, and your data. Sometimes that correlates with reality. Sometimes it doesn't. It is not an intern because an intern learns your context through consequences, feedback, and social correction. Copilot does not learn your culture unless you deliberately design context, constraints, and enforcement around it. And it is not an autopilot. Autopilots operate inside engineered envelopes with explicit failover behavior. Copilot operates inside language. Language is not an envelope. Language is a persuasion layer. So the clean definition is this. Cognitive collaboration is a human-controlled decision loop where the AI proposes and the human disposes. If you want to see whether your organization actually believes that, ask one question in any Copilot rollout meeting. When Copilot produces a plausible output that leads to a bad outcome, who owns that outcome? If the answer is the user, but the design doesn't force ownership, you have just described outsourced judgment with nicer branding. And that's where the cost starts. The cost curve. AI scales ambiguity faster than capability. Here's what most leaders miss. AI doesn't scale competence first. It scales whatever is already true in your environment. If your data is messy, it scales mess. If your decision rights are unclear, it scales ambiguity. If your culture avoids accountability, it scales plausible deniability. And because the output looks clean, the organization confuses polish with progress. That is the cost curve. AI scales ambiguity faster than capability because capability takes discipline and time, and ambiguity takes nothing. You can deploy ambiguity in a week. The scaling effect is brutally simple. One unclear assumption, once embedded in a prompt, a template, a saved Copilot page, or a recommended way of working, gets replicated across hundreds or thousands of decisions. Not because people are malicious, because people are busy. They see something that looks finished and they move. This is how plausible output becomes institutionalized. It starts with internal communications. A leader asks Copilot to draft a message about a reorg, a security incident, a policy change, a new benefit. The output reads well. It sounds empathetic. It sounds decisive. It also quietly invents certainty where there isn't any. It creates commitments nobody reviewed. It implies intent nobody approved. And because the language is coherent, it becomes the official story. Then it moves into policy and process. A manager uses Copilot to answer an HR question or to explain a compliance requirement or to summarize an internal standard. The answer is plausible. It's formatted. It's easier than opening the actual policy. So the response gets forwarded. Then it gets copied. Then it becomes precedent. Now the organization has drifted without noticing it drifted. And then eventually it hits operational decisions. Incident triage summaries, change impact analyses, vendor risk write-ups, forecast narratives, anything where a nice paragraph can substitute for actual thinking. At that point, the AI is not assisting. It is authoring the artifact that other humans will treat as evidence that judgment occurred. This is the rework tax, and it is the bill nobody budgets for. The rework tax shows up in 3 places. First, verification. You now have to spend time proving that the confident claims are grounded. That time is not optional. It is the cost of using a probabilistic system responsibly. But most organizations don't allocate that time, so verification becomes ad hoc, personal, and uneven. Second, cleanup. When the output is wrong or misaligned or legally risky, someone has to unwind it. That unwind rarely happens in the same meeting where the output was generated. It happens later, under pressure, with partial context, usually by someone who didn't create the artifact and doesn't have the authority to correct the underlying intent. Third, incident response and reputational repair. When AI-generated content causes a downstream problem, you don't just fix the content. You fix trust, you fix stakeholder confidence, you fix audit narratives, you fix the next set of questions that start with, how did this make it out the door? The hidden bill is cognitive load redistribution. AI shifts effort from creation to evaluation. That sounds like a win until you realize evaluation is harder to scale than creation. Creation can be delegated. Evaluation requires judgment, context, and the willingness to say no. It also requires time. and time is the one resource leadership will not admit is required. So the paradox appears. Teams generate more outputs than ever, but decisions get worse. People feel busier, but outcomes feel less owned. The organization increases throughput, but confidence in what is true decreases. And this is where hallucination becomes a convenient distraction. Hallucination is visible. It's a screenshot. It's a gotcha. It's something you can blame on the model. But the real risk is unowned outcomes. Unowned outcomes look like this. An AI-generated summary becomes the record. An AI-generated recommendation becomes the plan. An AI-generated policy interpretation becomes the rule. And when it breaks, nobody can identify the decision moment where a human accepted the trade-off and took responsibility. That is outsourced judgment. Not because the AI is malicious, but because the organization designed a system where acceptance is effortless and ownership is optional. So the cost curve isn't a technology curve, it's an accountability curve. If you don't embed judgment into the workflow, AI will scale the absence of it. And the organization will keep paying quietly through rework, drift, and incidents that feel unpredictable only because nobody wrote down who decided what mattered. Now, we need to talk about why this happens even in mature organizations. The automation to augmentation story is a false ladder. Automation, augmentation, collaboration, the false ladder. Most organizations tell themselves a comforting story. Automation, then augmentation, then collaboration. A neat maturity ladder, a linear climb. Get a few wins, build confidence, and eventually you collaborate with AI. That story is wrong in a specific way. It assumes the end state is just a more advanced version of the start state. The same work, done faster, with better tooling. But collaboration isn't more augmentation, as it's a different operating model. And if you treat it like a ladder, you will stall exactly where the responsibility shifts. Automation is the cleanest and most honest form of value. You define a rule, a boundary, and an outcome. A workflow routes approvals. A system enforces a control. A runbook remediates a known condition. The RACI stays crisp because the system isn't deciding what matters. It's executing what you already decided matters. That is why automation scales. It turns intent into repeatable consequence. Augmentation is where the organization starts to get addicted. Augmentation feels like free speed. It drafts the email, summarizes the meeting, generates the slide outline, cleans up the spreadsheet, writes the status update. The human still owns the work, but the machine removes friction. And because the outcomes are low stakes and reversible, nobody has to confront the accountability problem yet. If the draft is mediocre, you edit it. If the summary misses a point, you correct it. The organization can pretend this is just productivity. Collaboration is where that pretend contract dies, because collaboration is not helping you do the task. It is co-producing the thinking artifacts that other people will treat as decisions, commitments, and records. It changes how problems get framed, how options get generated, and how conclusions get justified. That means the human role shifts from creator to arbiter. And arbitration is where leadership discomfort shows up because it can't be delegated to a license. Here's why leaders stall. They want speed without responsibility shifts. They want the upside of a cognition engine without accepting that cognition generates ambiguity by default. They want outputs they can forward without having to own the trade-offs embedded in the words. They want the AI to behave like deterministic software because deterministic software lets them enforce compliance with checkboxes and dashboards. But a probabilistic system doesn't obey checkboxes. It obeys incentives, context, and neglect. So what happens in real deployments is not a smooth climb, it's a sideways slide. Organizations skip over collaboration by pretending they're still in augmentation. They keep the language of assist and productivity, but they start using AI in places where the output functions as judgment, policies, incident narratives, change impact statements, executive summaries that become direction by implication. And because nobody redefined accountability, the organization quietly converts drafting into deciding. This is why Copilot exposure is so uncomfortable. It doesn't just reveal data chaos, it reveals thinking chaos. Copilot can't fix fuzzy intent. It can only generate fluent substitutes for it. If you give it a vague goal like improve customer experience, it will produce a plausible plan that sounds like every other plan. If you give it conflicting constraints, it will produce a compromise that nobody chose. If you give it a political situation you refuse to name, it will generate language that avoids conflict while creating risk. The AI isn't failing there. You are watching the organization's unspoken assumptions leak into output. And once that output is shared, it becomes a social object. People react to it as if it is real. They align against it. They execute against it. They quote it. They treat it as their decision. And then when it causes harm, everyone looks for the person who approved it. That person often doesn't exist. This is the moment where the false ladder matters. Automation has explicit decision points. Augmentation hides them because stakes are low. Collaboration requires you to reintroduce them on purpose because stakes are high and outputs look finished even when the thinking isn't. So the practical diagnostic is simple. Where does your organization force a human to declare, I accept this conclusion and its consequences? If the answer is nowhere, You are not doing collaboration. You are doing outsourced judgment with better formatting. And if leaders keep insisting it's just a productivity tool, they are not being neutral. They are choosing a design, a system where decisions happen by drift. That is not a maturity ladder. That is architectural erosion in motion. Mental model to unlearn. AI gives answers. The next mistake is the one leaders defend the hardest because it feels efficient. AI gives answers. They are wrong. AI gives options that look like answers. And that distinction matters because answer-shaped language triggers closure. You stop checking, stop challenging, stop asking what changed. So run the self-test that leadership avoids. If this AI output turns out to be wrong, who gets called into the room? An answer is something you can stake an outcome on. An answer has an implied warranty. AI outputs don't come with warranties. They come with plausible structure, and plausible is not a quality standard. It's a warning label. The uncomfortable truth is this. Copilot is a synthesis engine, not a truth engine. It compresses context into a narrative that reads well. The moment you treat that narrative as an answer, you invert responsibility. You turn the tool into the decision maker and the human into the forwarder. And forwarding is not leadership. Copilot can be wrong without hallucinating. It just needs missing context, which is the default state of every organization. So the right mental model is not AI gives answers. It's AI generates hypotheses. If an AI output can move money, change access, create a commitment, set policy, or become a record, it is not an answer. It is a proposal that must be owned. Owned means someone has to say explicitly, I accept this. This is where answer-shaped text does damage at the leadership level. Executives live in abstraction. They already operate through summaries, status reports, and slide decks. So an AI-generated executive summary feels like a perfect fit. Faster, cleaner, more comprehensive. Except it isn't more comprehensive, it is more confident. And confidence triggers premature closure. Premature closure is a well-known failure mode in high-stakes work. You accept the first coherent explanation and stop exploring alternatives. In an AI context, premature closure happens when the output sounds complete enough to ship. The organization confuses completion with correctness, so the posture has to change. Healthy posture is to treat AI outputs as drafts and hypotheses. Unhealthy posture is to treat them as decisions. The difference is not philosophical. The difference is whether your process forces a judgment moment. A judgment moment is the point where a human must do three things: name the intent, name the trade-off, and name the owner. If the output can't survive those three sentences, it has no business becoming institutional truth. And here's the final part leaders don't like. If AI gives options, then someone has to decide what matters, not what is possible. What matters, that's the gap AI exposes. It will happily give you 10 plausible paths. It will even rank them, but it cannot carry the moral weight of choosing one path over another in your context, with your constraints, with your politics, and with your risk appetite. So when a leader asks, what does the AI say? They are not asking a neutral question. They are trying to transfer ownership to an unownable system. Everything clicked for most experienced architects when they realized this. The cost of AI isn't hallucination. The cost is decision avoidance with better grammar. And once you see that, the next failure mode becomes obvious. Leaders respond by trying to brute force better answers with more prompts. Mental model to unlearn. More prompts equals better results. So leaders discover the first trap. AI doesn't give answers, it gives option-shaped text. And instead of changing the operating model, they reach for the only lever they can see. More prompts, more templates, more prompt engineering, more libraries. That's not strategy. That's avoidance with extra steps. Prompt volume is usually a proxy for unclear intent or missing authority. People keep rewriting prompts because they can't state what they actually need, or they refuse to commit to the trade-offs they're asking for. So they keep nudging the system, hoping it will hand them an output that feels safe to forward. It won't. So ask the self-test that collapses the whole fantasy. If you deleted all your prompts tomorrow, would the decision still exist? Prompting can't replace problem definition. It can't replace constraints. It can't replace decision rights. A prompt is not a substitute for knowing what good looks like. When intent is coherent, you don't need 30 prompts. You need one. When intent is fuzzy, you can prompt forever and still never converge because you built a culture of try again instead of decide. Executives love prompt libraries because they feel like governance. But a prompt library is not a control plane. It doesn't enforce anything. It just makes it easier to generate more unowned artifacts faster. That is not maturity. That is industrialized ambiguity. And yes, prompts matter. Of course they do. If you ask for garbage, you get garbage. If you give no context, you get generic output. That's basic system behavior. But what matters more is whether the organization has discipline around three things that prompting can't fix. First, explicit constraints, not be compliant. Actual constraints: which policy governs, which data is authoritative, which audience is allowed, which risk threshold applies, what you refuse to claim, what you refuse to commit to. Second, decision ownership: who can accept the output as actionable, who can approve, who can override, who gets blamed when it's wrong. If that sounds harsh, good. Harsh is reality. Accountability is not a vibe. Third, enforced convergence. Where does the workflow force a human to stop generating options and pick one? If you don't have that, your organization will live inside drafts forever. It will generate more content and fewer decisions. This is why prompt obsession maps so cleanly to leadership weakness. Strategy fuzziness becomes prompt fuzziness. Unclear priorities become prompt bloat. Political avoidance becomes prompt gymnastics. The output looks professional, but the thinking stays uncommitted. So the mindset to unlearn is not prompts are useful. It's the belief that prompting is the work. It isn't. The work is judgment, framing the problem, declaring constraints, and owning consequences. Prompts are just how you ask the cognition engine to propose possibilities inside the box you should have built first. And if you don't build the box, Copilot will happily build one for you, out of whatever it can infer, which means you didn't get a better result. You got a better-looking substitute for a decision you avoided. Mental model to unlearn will train users later. After prompt obsession, the next lie shows up as a scheduling decision. Will train users later. Later is where responsibility goes to die, because the first 2 weeks are when habits form. That's when people learn what works, what gets praised, what saves time, and what they can get away with. So ask the only question that matters in week 2, what behavior did you reward in the first 2 weeks? AI doesn't just create outputs in those first 2 weeks, it creates behavioral defaults. If the default is copy-paste Copilot output into email, that becomes culture. If the default is forward the summary as the record, that becomes precedent. If the default is ask the AI to interpret policy so I don't have to read it, that becomes the unofficial operating model. You don't undo that with a training deck 3 months later. This is the uncomfortable truth. You don't train AI adoption, you condition judgment behavior. And conditioning happens at the speed of reward. In most organizations, the reward is simple: speed. You respond faster, you ship faster, you look productive. Nobody asks how you got there because they like the output. So you keep doing it, then someone else copies your pattern. Then a manager asks why you aren't using Copilot the same way. And now you've scaled a behavior before you ever defined what good looks like. This is why AI literacy is a misleading label. AI literacy is knowing that the system is probabilistic, that it can be wrong, that sources matter, that sensitive data matters. Fine, necessary, not sufficient. Judgment literacy is something else. The ability to treat AI output as a proposal, to interrogate it, to frame the decision, and to own the consequences. Judgment is the bottleneck, not prompts, not features, not licensing. And here's the part leadership avoids saying out loud. They delegate adoption to admins and then blame users. They assign licenses, run a few enablement sessions, publish a prompt gallery, and call it change management. Then they act surprised when users do what humans always do with low-friction systems. They optimize for speed and social safety. They avoid being wrong. They avoid being slow. They avoid taking responsibility for uncertainty. So they paste the AI output as is, because it sounds competent and it distributes blame. If the message is wrong, the user can quietly imply it was the tool. If the policy interpretation is wrong, they can say, that's what Copilot said. If the incident summary is wrong, they can claim they were just relaying what the system produced. That's not malice. That's rational behavior inside a culture that punishes uncertainty and rewards throughput. So training later is really, we'll let the system write our culture for 2 weeks and then hope a webinar fixes it. It won't. Training has to be front-loaded because early usage is where people learn what the organization tolerates. If nobody teaches verification discipline early, people won't invent it later. If nobody teaches that sharing AI output requires framing, people won't spontaneously start doing it. If nobody teaches that high-stakes outputs require escalation, people will treat everything like a draft until the day it becomes evidence in an audit or an incident review. The other reason later fails is that AI is not a static feature set. It changes continuously, the model changes, the UI changes, new grounding mechanisms appear, new agents show up. So if you think training is a phase, you are treating an evolving cognition layer like an email client migration. That mindset is obsolete. Training isn't enablement content, it's behavioral guardrails with repetition. The minimum training that matters is not, here are tips and tricks. It's 3 rules that remove deniability. 1. If you share AI output, you add 1 sentence that states your intent and confidence level. Draft for discussion. Recommendation pending validation. Confirmed against policy X. Anything that reattaches ownership to a human. 2. If the output affects access, money, policy, or risk posture, you escalate. Not by etiquette, by design. 3. If you can't explain why the output is correct, you're not allowed to act on it. These rules feel strict because they are. Strictness is how you stop judgment from evaporating. So the unlearn is simple. You don't get to postpone training in a probabilistic system. The system trains your users immediately. If you don't define the discipline, the platform defines the habit. And the habit will always drift towards speed and away from ownership. And once that drift exists, governance becomes the next lie people tell themselves. A mental model to unlearn. Governance slows innovation. Governance slows innovation is what people say when they want the benefits of scale without the cost of control. It is not a philosophy, it's a confession. So ask the self-test before you repeat it in your next steering committee. Where does the system physically prevent a bad decision from shipping? In the tool era, you could get away with weak governance because most failures stayed local. A bad spreadsheet breaks a forecast. A bad workflow breaks a process. The blast radius is annoying but bounded. Cognitive systems don't fail locally, they fail socially. They produce language that moves through the organization faster than any ticketing system, faster than any policy update, faster than any corrective communication. And once people repeat it, it becomes what we believe. So governance in an AI environment is not bureaucracy. It is entropy management, and if you refuse to manage entropy, you don't get innovation, you get drift. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Experimentation without guardrails is just uncontrolled variance. It creates 100 ways of doing the same thing, none of them documented, none of them accountable, and all of them capable of becoming precedent. That is not a learning culture. That is an organization producing noise and calling it progress. This is where executives reach for the wrong kind of governance. They write an acceptable use policy. They do a quick training module. They publish a list of do's and don'ts. They tell people not to paste confidential data into prompts, and then they declare governance done. That's not governance, that's paperwork. Real governance in this context is enforced intent, explicit decision rights, data boundaries, auditability, and escalation paths that activate when the output matters. The key shift is this: governance isn't about controlling the model, it's about controlling what the organization is allowed to treat as true. Because AI will generate plausible statements about anything you let it touch. Your policies, your customers, your risk posture, your incidents, your strategy. And if you don't build a mechanism that forces humans to validate, own, and record decisions, those plausible statements turn into institutional behavior. Over time, policies drift away. Missing policies create obvious gaps. Drifting policies create ambiguity. Ambiguity is where accountability dies, and AI accelerates that death because it produces reasonable language that fills the gap between what you meant and what you enforced. So let's talk about the thing people really mean when they complain about governance. They mean friction. They mean someone might have to slow down, ask permission, document a rationale, or admit uncertainty. Yes, that's the point. Innovation at enterprise scale is not fast output. It is safe change. It is the ability to try something new without destroying trust. And trust requires constraints that hold under pressure, not vibes that collapse when the first incident happens. This is why shadow AI is not a user problem. It is the predictable outcome of weak enforcement. If official tooling feels slow and unofficial tooling feels easy, people will root around controls. Not because they are evil, because the organization rewarded speed and didn't enforce boundaries. The system behaved as designed. You just didn't like the consequences. So the governance reframe is simple. Governance is how you scale trust. Trust isn't a marketing claim. Trust is an operational property. It emerges when three things are true. First, boundaries are clear. What data is in scope, what is out of scope, and what must never be inferred. Confidential is not a boundary, it's a label. Boundaries are enforced by access controls, data classification, and workflow rules that prevent accidental leakage. Second, decision rights are explicit. Who can interpret policy, who can approve exceptions, who can change risk posture, who can accept blast radius. If an AI output touches one of those areas, the workflow must force a named human to accept it. Not a team, not the business, a human with a calendar and a manager. Third, evidence exists, logs, decision records, and audit trails that survive the next incident review. If you can't reconstruct why a decision was made, you didn't govern it. You hoped it would work. The weird part is that this kind of governance is not anti-innovation. It is what makes innovation repeatable. It turns experimentation into learning. Because learning requires traceability. What did we try? Why did we try it? What happened? And who owned the trade-off? Without that, you don't have innovation. You have uncontrolled behavior and selective memory. So when someone says governance slows innovation, the correct response is no. Governance slows fantasy. Thinking without enforcement is fantasy. Enforcement without thinking is bureaucracy. Your job is to build the middle, where AI can propose, humans can judge, and the system can enforce consequences with no deniability. The triad: cognition, action, judgment. So here's the model that stops this from turning into a moral lecture about using AI responsibly. It's a systems model. 3 systems, 3 jobs, no romance, system of cognition, system of action, system of judgment. If you can't name which one you're operating in, you're already drifting. And drift is how organizations end up in post-incident meetings pretending nobody could have seen it coming. Start with the system of cognition. This is where M365 Copilot lives. Chat, summaries, drafts, synthesis across email, meetings, documents, and whatever content the graph can legally expose. Cognition is not execution. Cognition is possibility generation, interpretations, options, narratives, and proposed next steps. It is fast, it is wide, it is persuasive, and it has one built-in flaw. It will produce coherent language even when the underlying reality is incoherent. That's not a bug, that's what it's designed to do. So the output of cognition must always be treated as provisional. Candidate thinking, a draft artifact that still needs judgment. If you treat cognition output as the decision, you have already collapsed the triad into a single fragile point of failure. The model said so. Now the system of action. This is where consequences get enforced. Workflows, approvals, access changes, containment actions, policy exceptions, audit trails. In most enterprises, this is some combination of ticketing, workflow engines, and the systems that actually touch production reality. ServiceNow is an obvious example, but the brand doesn't matter. The function matters. Action is the part of the organization that turns intent into irreversible effects. Action systems are allowed to be boring. They should be. They exist to create friction in the right places, to force acknowledgement, to route decisions to authorized owners, to record evidence, to stop looks fine thinking from becoming production downtime. And then there is the system of judgment. This is the human layer, not as a slogan, as a constraint the enterprise cannot escape. Judgment is where intent is framed, trade-offs are chosen, and responsibility is assigned to a person who can be held accountable. Judgment is the only system that can legitimately answer questions like, what matters right now? What is acceptable risk? What is fair? What is defensible? What does the organization refuse to do, even if it is efficient? AI cannot answer those questions. It can mimic answers. It can produce language that resembles them, but it cannot own the consequences. And if it can't own consequences, it is not judgment. That distinction matters. Because most failed AI strategies accidentally invert the triad. They treat the system of cognition as if it is judgment, and they treat the system of action as if it is optional bureaucracy. So they get lots of thinking artifacts and very little enforced reality. The organization becomes a factory of plausible language with no operational gravity. This is the diagnostic line you already have, and it is not negotiable. Thinking without enforcement is fantasy. Enforcement without thinking is bureaucracy. Now translate that into behavior. If Copilot produces a summary of an incident, that's cognition. If a human classifies severity and chooses a response posture, that's judgment. If a workflow enforces containment steps, approvals, notifications, and evidence capture, that's action. If any one of those three is missing, you don't have a system. You have a vibe. Cognition without judgment is noise. It produces options nobody chooses. Judgment without action is theater. It produces decisions nobody implements. Action without judgment is dangerous. It produces consequences nobody intended. And here's the part that makes this model operational instead of philosophical. The handoffs are where organizations fail. The output of cognition must enter a judgment moment. Not, someone should review this. A design checkpoint where a named human must accept or reject the interpretation, and where the acceptance triggers action pathways with recorded ownership. That is how you stop outsourced judgment, not by telling people to be careful, not by publishing guidance, by engineering a reality where the organization cannot move from possible to done without a human decision owner being visible. This also explains why governance that lives only in M365 feels weak. M365 can guide cognition, it can restrict data exposure, it can log usage, but it cannot by itself enforce enterprise consequences. That enforcement lives in action systems. That's where you put the brakes. That's where you put the receipts. So when you hear someone describe an AI strategy as, we rolled out Copilot and trained users, you should hear what they didn't say. They didn't say where judgment lives. They didn't say where action gets enforced. They didn't say how ownership is recorded. Which means they built a cognition layer on top of an accountability vacuum. And now, to make this real, we're going to run the triad through scenarios everyone recognizes, starting with the one that fails the fastest: security incident triage. Scenario 1, security incident triage. Security incident triage is the cleanest place to watch this fail because the organization already believes it has process, it already believes it has governance, it already believes it has accountability. Then Copilot shows up and turns analysis into a decorative layer that nobody operationalizes. Start with the system of cognition. Copilot can ingest the mess humans can't. Alert summaries, email threads, Teams chat fragments, meeting notes, Defender notifications, a pile of half-finished work items, and the one key sentence someone dropped in a channel at 2:13 a.m. It can synthesize those signals into a narrative. What happened, what might be happening, what changed, who touched what, and what it thinks the likely root cause is. That synthesis is valuable. It compresses time. It reduces the cognitive load of finding the story. It proposes interpretations a tired human might miss. But it is still cognition. It is still candidate thinking. So a well-designed triage flow treats Copilot output the same way it treats an analyst's first pass. Provisional, biased by incomplete data, and requiring explicit judgment before consequence. The system of judgment is where a human does the work nobody wants to admit is work. Severity is not a number. It is an organizational decision about blast radius, tolerable risk, regulatory exposure, and response posture. Intent is not a pattern match. Intent is a claim you will defend later in a post-incident review, in an audit, and possibly in a legal conversation. So the judgment step is where someone has to say out loud, this is a probable phishing compromise, or this is credential stuffing, or this is an internal misconfiguration with external symptoms, and then commit to a response posture, contain now and accept disruption, or observe longer and accept uncertainty. That isn't something Copilot can own. That is a human decision because the organization is the one paying the trade-off. Now, the system of action has to make the decision real. This is where most organizations fail. They let cognition produce a beautiful triage summary, they let a human nod at it, and then they drop back into chat-driven execution. Can someone reset the account? Did we block the IP? Who owns comms? Are we notifying legal? All those questions are action questions, and if they aren't enforced through workflow, they become optional under pressure. So the action system needs to compile consequence. Severity classification triggers a required containment playbook, required approvals, required communications, required evidence collection, and required post-incident review. Not because ServiceNow is magic, because enforcement is the only way to prevent the organization from improvising itself into inconsistency. Here's what the failure mode looks like in the real world. Copilot flags risk. It surfaces 3 plausible interpretations. Everyone agrees it looks concerning. And then nothing is enforced. No one is named as the decision owner. No one records the rationale for why it was treated as low severity versus high. No one triggers mandatory containment steps. So the organization generates a lot of analysis artifacts and a lot of chat messages, but no operational gravity. Alert fatigue scales, because if every alert gets a better narrative but still doesn't produce enforced decisions, you've improved the story and preserved the paralysis. People stop trusting the summaries, not because they're wrong, but because the organization never does anything decisive with them. This is the subtle corrosion. The SOC starts to look busy, while the risk posture stays unchanged. Leadership sees dashboards and summaries and assumes governance is functioning. In reality, the accountability pathway is missing. The decision moment was never designed. So when the same pattern repeats, nobody can say, last time we decided X because of Y, and here's the record. And this is where the line lands every single time. Thinking without enforcement is fantasy. If the triage summary doesn't force a choice, and the choice doesn't trigger consequence, then Copilot didn't make you safer. It made you more articulate while you remained indecisive. The hard truth is this: analysis without action pathways becomes decorative intelligence. It produces confidence theater. It produces the feeling that the organization is handling risk because it can describe risk in nice paragraphs. But security is not narrative. Security is consequence. So the proper handoff is brutally simple. Copilot proposes interpretations. A human selects intent and severity and becomes the named owner of that decision. The action system enforces the response path and records evidence. That record survives the next incident review. It also survives leadership denial because it removes the ability to pretend nobody decided. The AI didn't decide what mattered. It decided what was possible. The organization decided nothing. And so nothing meaningful happened. Scenario 2, HR policy interpretation. Security triage fails fast because pressure forces the cracks to show. HR policy fails differently. It fails quietly, politely, and at scale. Because HR policy is where organizations store ambiguity on purpose, exceptions, discretion, manager judgment, union context, local law differences, and the uncomfortable reality that fairness isn't a formula. So when you drop a cognitive system into that environment, you don't just get helpful drafts, you get doctrine by accident. Start again with the system of cognition. Copilot can read policy documents, prior HR cases, email threads, Teams chats, and whatever precedent exists in tickets and knowledge articles. It can summarize eligibility rules. It can propose response language. It can even generate a decision tree that looks reasonable and calm. This is the part leaders love because it feels like consistency. It feels like scale. It feels like standard answers, replacing messy human variation. But the output is still cognition. It is still a plausible interpretation of text. The system of judgment is the manager, HR business partner, or people leader who has to decide what the organization is actually willing to stand behind. That includes things policy text rarely captures: context, intent, equity, cultural precedent, and second-order effects. A classic example is exception handling. An employee asks for a deviation, extended leave, remote work outside the policy, an accommodation, a one-off schedule change, a benefit interpretation that doesn't fit the template. The AI will generate a neat answer because neatness is its job. It will cite sections. It will propose language that sounds considerate while staying compliant. And this is where the failure begins, because exceptions are not technical. Exceptions are moral and organizational decisions. They set precedent, they change expectations, they alter trust, they become stories employees tell each other, which is how culture gets enforced in the real world. So the judgment moment is not what does the policy say. The judgment moment is, Do we apply the policy strictly here? Do we allow an exception? And if we do, what boundary are we setting so this doesn't become the new rule? If you don't force that decision to be explicit, Copilot will produce an answer that becomes policy by repetition. Now, the system of action. In HR, action is not create a ticket. Action is record the decision, apply downstream effects, and make the exception visible to governance. That means the workflow has to capture who decided, what rationale they used, what policy they referenced, what exception they granted, and what review is required. It also needs to trigger whatever consequences follow: payroll changes, access adjustments, manager approvals, legal review, or a case review board if required. This is where thinking without enforcement is fantasy gets sharper. If Copilot drafts a perfect response, but the organization doesn't force the manager to log the decision and own it, then the only thing that scaled was deniability. The manager can say, I followed what the system suggested. HR can say, we didn't approve that. Legal can say, that's not our interpretation. And the employee hears one message: the organization has no coherent owner for fairness. That is not a people problem. It is a system design problem. Here's the predictable failure mode. A manager pings Copilot. Employee is requesting X based on policy Y. What should I say? Copilot produces a clean answer. The manager forwards it. The employee accepts it as an official position. A week later, another employee requests the same thing. Someone else asks Copilot. The wording is slightly different, but the intent is similar. Now you have inconsistency. Or worse, you have a de facto rule that was never approved. Then it escalates. An employee disputes treatment. HR investigates. They ask, who approved this exception? Nobody knows. There's no record. There was a chat. There was an email. There was a paragraph that sounded official. But there was no decision log, no owner, no rationale, no review. So the system said so, which is the most corrosive phrase in any organization because it converts leadership into bureaucracy and bureaucracy into moral abdication. The uncomfortable point is that AI didn't create the ambiguity. HR policy already contains it. AI just makes it fast to manufacture official-sounding interpretations of that ambiguity. So the operational fix isn't tell managers not to use Copilot. That's fantasy too. They will use it because speed wins. The fix is to design the handoff. Copilot can propose language and surface precedent patterns. The manager must select intent, strict policy application, approved exception, or escalation required. Then the workflow enforces consequence. It records the decision, triggers approvals, and creates an auditable trail. And the line that matters here is the same one as security, just quieter. The AI didn't decide what was fair. It decided what was possible. The organization decided nothing. And then everyone acted like a decision happened anyway. Scenario 3, IT change management. IT change management is where outsourced judgment stops being a philosophical concern and becomes an outage with a timestamp. And it's where AI makes the failure cleaner, faster, and harder to argue with because the paperwork looks better right up until production breaks. Start with the system of cognition. Copilot can draft what humans hate writing: impact analysis, dependency lists, comms plans, rollback steps, stakeholder summaries, and the ritual language of risk and mitigation. It can scan related tickets, past incidents, meeting notes, and the change description itself, and produce something that sounds like a mature engineering organization. This is the seductive part. The artifact looks complete. The tone is confident. The structure matches what CAB expects. It reads like someone did the work. But cognition is still not judgment. It is still a proposal generator wearing a suit. The system of judgment in change management is the part most organizations pretend is automated already. Acceptable blast radius. Because blast radius is not a technical measurement. It is an organizational decision about what the business is willing to lose today. Availability, performance, customer trust, operational focus, so a change can happen. The AI can list potential impacts. It can propose mitigation steps. It can recommend a maintenance window. What it cannot do is decide which failure mode is tolerable, which stakeholder gets to be angry, and which risk is worth accepting to land the change. That's the architect's job, or the change owner's job, or whoever will be sitting in the post-incident review explaining why this was reasonable. So the judgment moment is where someone must say explicitly, we are changing X. We believe the blast radius is Y, the rollback posture is Z, and we accept the residual risk. Without that sentence, you don't have a change. You have a document. Now, the system of action is where this becomes real. A change workflow should enforce the consequences of that judgment. Approvals, blackout windows, evidence attachments, pre-change checks, implementation steps, and mandatory post-implementation review if certain conditions are met. Action systems exist because humans under pressure improvise. They skip steps. They rely on memory. They just do it real quick. Workflow exists to stop improvisation from becoming policy. Here's the failure mode AI introduces. Copilot produces a polished impact analysis. It proposes a rollback plan. It suggests comms language. The change record looks good enough that reviewers assume the hard thinking already happened. The CAB meeting moves faster. Approvals happen by momentum. And the organization confuses completeness with correctness. Then the change lands. Something unexpected happens. Not necessarily a hallucination problem, a context problem, a hidden dependency, a permission edge case, a replication lag, an integration that was out of scope in the mind of the person who requested the change, but very much in scope in production reality. Now you have an outage, and you start asking the only question that matters. Who decided this was acceptable? In too many organizations, the answer is a shrug disguised as process. The change record has text, it has risk language, it has mitigation bullets, it even has a rollback section. But nobody can point to the judgment moment where a human accepted the blast radius and owned the trade-off, because the artifact got treated as the decision, and that's outsourced judgment in its purest form. The document looks like governance, so governance is assumed to exist. This is why looks fine is one of the most expensive phrases in IT. AI increases the number of things that look fine. That's the problem. So the correct handoff is not Copilot writes the change record and we move on. The correct handoff is Copilot proposes the thinking artifact, a human selects intent and declares risk posture, and the workflow enforces that posture with irreversible constraints. For example, if the human selects high blast radius, the action system should require senior approval, enforce a tighter window, require a tested rollback, and force a post-implementation review. If the human selects low blast radius, the workflow can be lighter, but it should still record who made that classification. That is how you turn change management from paper compliance into operational gravity. And if you want a diagnostic that cuts through the theater, ask this: can you reconstruct the decision owner and their rationale for every outage-causing change in the last year? If you can't, you don't have change management. You have a calendar. So the uncomfortable point stands. Even here, the AI didn't cause the outage. Unowned judgment did. The AI generated what was possible. The organization never forced a human to decide what was acceptable. And the system enforced nothing until production enforced it for you. The skills AI makes more valuable: judgment. So after the scenarios, the pattern should feel obvious. AI didn't break the organization. It revealed what was missing. And what's missing almost everywhere is judgment. Not intelligence, not information, not output capacity. Judgment, the ability to choose under uncertainty, to name trade-offs, and to own consequences in public. AI increases the volume of plausible options. That means it increases the volume of uncertainty you have to arbitrate. If your organization was already weak at arbitration, AI doesn't help. It just accelerates the collapse. This is the uncomfortable truth. AI doesn't replace decision-making. It industrializes decision pressure. Before, the bottleneck was production. Writing the draft, building the deck, pulling the data, creating the status report. AI makes those cheap, which means the scarce resource becomes the part nobody can automate. Deciding what matters, what is acceptable, and what you are willing to be accountable for. And when judgment becomes the scarce resource, organizations do what they always do with scarcity. They try to outsource it. They treat the AI's output as if it is a decision, because the output looks like a decision. It has structure, it has confidence, it has bullet points, it has a neat conclusion. In a culture trained to worship throughput, that's enough. The artifact gets mistaken for ownership. But ownership is not a format. Ownership is a person. Judgment is not being smart. It's arbitration under constraints you didn't choose. Time, politics, risk, unclear data, conflicting incentives. The human job is to take that mess and still pick a direction with a rationale that survives contact with reality. AI cannot do that job because AI cannot pay the cost of being wrong. So here's the shift. In an AI-rich environment, judgment becomes the primary differentiator between teams that scale capability and teams that scale confusion. Strong judgment looks boring in the way auditors love. It names assumptions. It identifies what's unknown. It states what would change the decision. It documents the trade-off. It assigns a decision owner who is not a committee. It doesn't hide behind "we'll monitor." It defines what monitoring means and what triggers action. Weak judgment, in contrast, looks productive. It ships more drafts, it generates more options, it produces more analysis artifacts, it uses more tools, it schedules more meetings, it creates more alignment. It creates activity that feels like work while avoiding the moment where someone says, "I choose this and I accept the consequences." That is why AI makes weak leadership worse. It gives weak leadership more ways to avoid choosing while still looking busy. Now take the executive lens, because executives are the ones most tempted to outsource judgment. They live in abstraction. They receive summaries. They make decisions based on compressed narratives. So an AI-generated summary feels like a perfect fit. Better compression, more coverage, fewer gaps. Except it doesn't reduce gaps. It hides them. The KPI for leadership in an AI environment can't be throughput. Throughput will always go up. The KPI has to be decision quality, and decision quality is visible in outcomes and in the trail of reasoning you can defend later. The hard part is that judgment discipline requires admitting uncertainty publicly, in writing, with your name attached. Most organizations punish that. They reward certainty theater. They reward confidence even when it's fake, because fake confidence moves meetings forward. AI produces fake confidence on demand, so the temptation becomes structural. This is why outsourced judgment is the real failure mode. Hallucinations are easy to blame. Decision avoidance is harder because it implicates everyone. So if you want a practical definition of judgment in this model, Here it is. Judgment is selecting a trade-off and making it explicit. Everything else is commentary. When a security lead classifies an incident as low severity, they are choosing a trade-off. Less disruption now, more risk later. When a manager grants an HR exception, they are choosing a trade-off. Compassion now, precedent later. When an architect approves a change, they are choosing a trade-off. Progress now, blast radius later. When finance holds forecast guidance, they are choosing a trade-off. Stability now, credibility later. AI can list those trade-offs. It cannot choose one that aligns with your values and constraints. That choice is leadership, and the organization needs to start treating that as the work, not as an overhead. So the skill stack shifts. The person who can arbitrate under uncertainty becomes more valuable than the person who can draft under pressure. The team that can frame intent and enforce ownership will outperform the team that can generate 100 plausible paths. The enterprise that builds judgment moments into workflows will scale trust. The enterprise that doesn't will scale deniability. And that's the final irony. AI was sold as productivity. What it actually does is expose whether your organization is capable of responsible choice. If you are, AI amplifies clarity. If you aren't, it amplifies entropy. The skills AI makes more valuable: problem framing. If judgment is the scarce resource, problem framing is the control surface that determines whether judgment even has a chance. Most organizations treat framing like preamble, a few sentences at the top of a doc, then they rush to the real work. AI punishes that habit immediately, because if you don't frame the problem, the model will, and it will frame it using whatever scraps of context it can infer. Your wording, your org's historical artifacts, and the ambient assumptions embedded in your data. That's not collaboration, that's abdication. Problem framing is the act of declaring intent, constraints, and success conditions before you generate options. It is the difference between help me write something and help me decide something. AI is excellent at generating possibilities. It is useless at deciding relevance unless you tell it what relevance means here. This is why AI often produces polished nonsense. Not because the model is broken, but because the question was. A bad frame produces outputs that are internally coherent and externally wrong. They sound reasonable, but they solve a different problem than the one you actually have. They optimize for the wrong stakeholder. They assume the wrong constraints. They move fast in the wrong direction. And the organization accepts them because they read well and nobody wants to admit the initial ask was vague. That's the core failure. Vague intent scales into confident artifacts. Good framing fixes that by doing three things up front. First, it declares the decision type. Is this a recommendation, a policy interpretation, a communication draft, an escalation, or an irreversible action? If you can't name the decision type, you can't govern the output. You can't decide what validation is required. You can't decide who needs to own it. You're just generating text. Second, it declares constraints. Not aspirational constraints, real constraints. What must be true? What must not happen? What sources are authoritative? What time window matters? What risk threshold applies? What you are not allowed to claim? Constraints are the rails. Without rails, you get plausible drift. Third, it declares success conditions. What will a good output enable a human to do? Decide severity, notify stakeholders, approve a change, reject an exception. If the output doesn't change an action, it's entertainment. And here's the uncomfortable part. Framing is work that can't be outsourced. It's upstream judgment in its purest form. It forces leaders to say what they want, what they believe, and what they're willing to trade. That's why most leaders skip it. They prefer to ask for a strategy or a plan and let the AI fill the void. Then they act surprised when the plan is generic or optimistic or politically incoherent. The AI didn't fail. The leader refused to specify what reality they are operating in. So the discipline has to be explicit, and it has to be small enough that people will actually do it. Here's the simplest habit that changes everything. Before you share any AI output, write a one-sentence frame. One sentence, not a template, not a workshop. A sentence that names intent, constraints, and the next action. Examples sound like this. Draft for discussion. Propose 3 response options to this incident summary, assuming we prioritize containment over uptime and we must preserve audit evidence. Working interpretation. Summarize how policy X applies to this request and flag where manager discretion or escalation is required without implying an approval. Change assessment. List dependencies and rollback steps for this deployment, assuming a 2-hour window and 0 tolerance for data loss. Notice what that does. It forces the human to state the trade-off. It forces constraints into the open. It makes it harder to forward the output as if it is a finished decision. It reattaches cognition to intent. And it also makes the AI better. Not because you found a better prompt, because you finally told the system what game you're playing. This is the bridge between the prompt obsession chapter and reality. Prompts are downstream, framing is upstream. If the upstream is incoherent, downstream effort is just thrash. In other words, good framing makes fewer prompts necessary because it collapses ambiguity before it becomes output. And framing is also how you stop the social failure mode where answer-shaped text becomes truth by repetition. When the first line of an email says draft for discussion, the organization has a chance to treat it as a draft. When it says nothing, the organization treats it as policy. So if you want the high-leverage mental shift, stop asking AI for answers and stop asking your people for prompts. Ask for frames, because the frame determines what the organization is actually doing. Thinking, deciding, or just producing language. And if you can't tell which one it is, the organization can't either. The skills AI makes more valuable: context and ethics. Problem framing gets you into the right room. Context tells you what not to say once you're in it. And AI is terrible at that because context is mostly made of things humans don't write down. History, power, timing, reputational risk, and the quiet rules about what the organization is willing to admit. Copilot can summarize what happened. It can infer what might be happening. It can propose what could be said. It cannot reliably know what this organization is allowed to say, to whom, right now, with these stakeholders watching. That's context. It's local, it's situational, it's political, it's often ethical, and it's where most real-world damage happens. This is why just draft the email is not a safe ask. The email isn't just words, it's a commitment. It creates expectations, it becomes evidence, it shapes how people interpret intent. And AI will happily draft something that is technically well written and strategically catastrophic because it doesn't feel the cost of being wrong. Context awareness is the human skill of mapping an output to the actual environment. Who is impacted? What is at stake? What is irreversible? And what will be misunderstood on first read? Most organizations don't teach this explicitly because they assume seniority equals context. It doesn't. Seniority often equals abstraction. AI makes that worse by making it easy to operate at the level of summary without ever touching reality. So you need a discipline. Before you act on AI output, you ask a context question that the model can't answer for you. What is the consequence of being wrong here? Who gets harmed if we sound confident and we're wrong? What downstream systems will treat this as authoritative? What parts of this statement are unverifiable, even if they sound reasonable? That's not paranoia. That's governance of meaning. Now add ethics, because people like to pretend ethics is optional until it becomes a headline. Ethical reasoning is not a compliance module. It's the ability to notice when a decision is being disguised as a suggestion, when an exception is being normalized, or when a probabilistic summary is being treated as truth because it feels convenient. The dangerous part of AI isn't that it lies. The dangerous part is that it speaks fluently in the language of legitimacy. If it drafts an HR response, it sounds like HR. If it drafts a security update, it sounds like security. If it drafts an executive statement, it sounds like leadership. Tone becomes camouflage. That's how bias and unfairness scale. Not through obvious malice, but through plausible defaults that nobody challenges because they read well. And bias is rarely just demographic. Organizational bias shows up as invisible priorities. Protect the schedule, protect the narrative, protect the executive, minimize escalation, avoid admitting uncertainty. AI absorbs those priorities from the artifacts you already produced. Then it amplifies them, because that's what pattern synthesis does. So the ethical posture has to be explicit. Humans own outcomes. Tools do not. Not in principle, in practice. That means you can't let "the system said so" become the justification for a decision that affects someone's access, pay, job, health, or reputation. If your organization accepts that excuse, you've built a moral escape hatch. And once people have an escape hatch, responsibility diffuses. Here's the operational test. Can a human defend the decision without mentioning the AI? If the answer is no, you didn't make a decision. You delegated one, and you delegated it to a system that cannot be accountable. This also ties back to the triad because ethics lives in the handoff between cognition and action. Cognition proposes, fine. But the moment you operationalize an output, send the email, deny the request, contain the account, publish the policy interpretation, you moved into action. And action creates consequences whether you meant to or not. So the judgment moment must include an ethics check that is almost offensively simple. Who is affected? What is the harm if this is wrong? What is the appeal path if we got it wrong? If you can't answer those questions, you are not ready to operationalize the output. You're still thinking or pretending you are. This is why the AI mindset shift is not about being nicer to the machine or learning more prompt tricks. It's about reasserting human agency where the platform makes agency easy to forget. AI will generate text. That's the cheap part now. The expensive part is context, knowing what the text means in the world you actually live in. And the most expensive part is ethics, owning who gets hurt when you pretend the machine made the call. If you can hold context and ethics together, you can use AI without dissolving responsibility. If you can't, the organization will keep scaling fluency and calling it competence. And that's how judgment erodes quietly until the day it becomes undeniable. The atrophy pattern, why junior roles break first. If you want to see the future of AI in your organization, don't watch the executives. Watch the junior roles. They fail first. Not because they're less capable, but because they sit closest to the work that AI replaces cleanly. drafting, summarizing, formatting, translating chaos into something that looks coherent. And that work was never just output. It was apprenticeship. Junior roles learn judgment by doing the boring parts under supervision. They learn what a good answer looks like because they had to produce 10 bad ones and get corrected. They learn what matters because someone redlined their draft and told them why. They learn what's defensible because their manager asked, "How do you know that?" And they had to point to evidence. AI short-circuits that entire loop because now the junior can generate a competent-looking artifact on the first try. Not a correct artifact, a competent-looking one. And the organization, being addicted to speed, will accept looks fine as proof of progress, especially when the writing is clean and the bullets are crisp. This is how capability collapses while throughput rises. The junior never builds the muscle for framing the problem, selecting sources, checking assumptions, or defending trade-offs. They build a different muscle: prompt iteration and output polishing. That is not judgment. That is interface literacy. And then leadership acts surprised when the next generation can't run the system without the tool. Here's the structural reason this hits juniors harder. Their work is template-shaped. Status updates, notes, first drafts, customer emails, requirement summaries, basic analysis. AI is an infinite template engine. So the junior's role gets absorbed into the machine's lowest cost capability, and the organization calls it efficiency. But apprenticeship isn't efficient. It's expensive by design. It forces slow thinking. It forces error. It forces correction. It forces the junior to internalize standards instead of borrowing them. When you remove that friction, you don't create a faster junior. You create a person who can move text around without understanding what it means. And you'll still promote them because the surface level signals look good. Now add the second failure mode, overconfidence. Fluent text triggers authority bias. People read something well written and assume it was well thought. AI exploits that bias perfectly because it produces tone, structure, and certainty on demand. So the junior becomes dangerous in a way they weren't before. They can ship plausible decisions faster than they can recognize risk. That's not a moral indictment. It's a predictable outcome of how humans evaluate language. And this is where the atrophy pattern becomes visible. Strong performers get stronger. Weak performers get hidden. A strong junior uses AI as scaffolding. They ask better questions. They validate outputs. They treat the model as a sparring partner. They improve faster because they have a base layer of judgment and they use the tool to extend it. A weak junior uses AI as an authority proxy. They accept the first plausible answer. They stop learning the underlying domain. They confuse speed with competence. And because the artifacts look professional, the organization can't tell the difference until the person is in a role where mistakes have blast radius. That widening gap is the real workforce risk. AI doesn't democratize expertise. It amplifies existing judgment disparities. You already see this pattern in every other system. Tools don't fix bad thinking, they scale it. AI is just the first tool that produces outputs that look like thinking. So what happens organizationally? Senior people stop delegating work to juniors and start delegating judgment to the AI. Juniors stop being trained and start being throughput amplifiers. Managers stop coaching and start reviewing polished drafts that contain hidden errors. The feedback loop degrades, correction becomes sporadic, standards drift, and the organization quietly loses its bench strength. Then, 6 months later, leadership complains about AI skills gaps and buys more training. But the gap isn't AI usage, it's judgment development, and this is why the "we'll train later" lie is especially toxic for junior roles. The first 2 weeks set defaults, and juniors are the ones most likely to adopt defaults as doctrine. If the default is copy-paste, they will copy-paste. If the default is the AI knows, they will believe it. If the default is speed gets rewarded, they will optimize for speed. That's not rebellion, that's adaptation. So if you care about talent, you have to treat AI as a threat to apprenticeship, not just a productivity win. You need design judgment moments, not only for risk and compliance, but for learning, places where juniors must explain rationale, cite sources, and state confidence before their work becomes action. Otherwise, you will build an organization that ships faster, sounds smarter, and understands less. And that is not transformation, that is atrophy with better formatting. Organizational readiness, AI, psychological safety. So the junior roles break first, but the organization fails for a different reason. It fails because people stop speaking clearly when they don't feel safe to be wrong. AI psychological safety isn't a soft concept. It's an operational requirement because cognitive collaboration requires a behavior most enterprises actively punish, saying, "I don't know, I disagree," or "this output feels wrong." And if people can't say that out loud, the system will drift until it hits a wall. There are 2 kinds of fear that show up immediately when you introduce Copilot at scale. The first is the obvious one, fear of being replaced. That fear makes people hide work, hoard context, and avoid experimenting in ways that would make them look less necessary. They reduce transparency because transparency feels like volunteering for redundancy. The second fear is quieter and more corrosive. Fear of being wrong on behalf of the AI. Because when you send an AI-drafted email or share an AI-generated summary, you aren't just wrong privately. You are wrong in a way that looks official. You are wrong in a way that spreads. You are wrong in a way that can be screenshot, forwarded, and quoted later. So people adapt. They stop experimenting in high-visibility channels. They use AI privately and quietly. They paste the output with minimal edits because editing takes time, and if they're going to be blamed anyway, they might as well move fast. Or they avoid AI entirely and resent the people who use it, because the cultural signal becomes speed is rewarded, mistakes are punished, and ambiguity is your problem. That is not readiness. That is a pressure cooker. Now add the enterprise's favorite habit, perfection culture. Most organizations have spent decades training people to pretend certainty. They reward the person who sounds confident, not the person who asks the better question. They reward the deck that looks complete, not the decision that's defensible. They treat ambiguity as incompetence. AI turns that culture into a liability because AI produces certainty theater at industrial scale. If the organization already struggles to tolerate uncertainty, it will accept confident output as relief. Not because it's right, because it ends the uncomfortable pause where someone has to think. So psychological safety in an AI environment is not about protecting feelings, it's about protecting dissent. It's about creating permission, structurally, for people to say 3 things without career damage. This is a draft. This is a hypothesis. This needs escalation. If those sentences don't exist in your culture, Copilot will become a narrative engine that nobody challenges until the consequences arrive. And the consequences always arrive. Here's what most organizations get wrong. They treat safety as a communications problem. They run an awareness campaign. They say it's okay to experiment. They tell people there are no stupid questions. They publish a Viva Engage community with weekly tips. They make posters, they do promptathons, they do all the visible things. Then the first person gets burned for a mistake made with AI. Maybe they sent a draft with the wrong number. Maybe they summarized the meeting incorrectly. Maybe they used the wrong tone in a sensitive message. Maybe they interpreted policy too confidently. It doesn't matter. What matters is the outcome. The organization punishes the mistake as if it was traditional negligence instead of recognizing it as a predictable failure mode of probabilistic cognition. And at that moment, experimentation stops, not officially, quietly. People don't need a memo to learn what is safe. They watch what happens to the first person who gets embarrassed in public. The culture sets the rule in a single incident. So readiness requires something more disciplined, a shared language for good AI usage that teams can use to self-correct without shame. Not use Copilot more. Use these sentences. My confidence is low. Here are the sources I used. Here's what I didn't verify. Here's the decision owner. Those statements are how you keep cognition from becoming doctrine. They also reduce the load on managers because managers can't review everything. They need signals that tell them when to trust, when to dig, and when to escalate. Now connect this to governance because safety without guardrails becomes chaos. You can't tell people to experiment and then give them no boundaries. That creates fear too because nobody knows what is allowed. People either freeze or they root around controls. So psychological safety has a minimum viable boundary, make judgment visible. That's the whole requirement. If someone uses AI to produce an output that will influence a decision, they must attach a judgment statement. What it is, what it's for, and who owns it. If they can't, they don't ship it. This is not a training initiative. It is behavioral design. And it's how you create a culture where people can collaborate with AI without surrendering responsibility. Because the goal isn't to make everyone comfortable. The goal is to make avoidance impossible and dissent safe enough to surface before the incident review does it for you. Minimal, irreversible prescriptions that remove deniability. So here's where most episodes like this go off the rails. They hear judgment and they immediately build a maturity model, a roadmap, a center of excellence, a 12-week adoption program with badges and a SharePoint hub and a congratulatory town hall. That is how organizations turn a real problem into a safe ceremony. This needs the opposite. Minimal prescriptions that remove deniability, things you can't agree with and then ignore, things that make avoidance visible immediately in normal work. 3 of them, that's it. First, decision logs. Not a repository, not a wiki project, a single-page artifact that exists because memory is not governance. Every meaningful decision influenced by AI gets a decision log. 1 page, short, owned by a named human, stored where the action system can reference it. It contains 5 fields and none of them are optional. What is the decision? Who owns it? What options were considered? What trade-off was chosen? What would cause a reversal? That last one matters more than people admit because it forces honesty. It makes you state what evidence would change your mind, which is how you prevent post hoc rationalization. And the log explicitly says whether AI was used for cognition, summarization, drafting, option generation, not to shame anyone. To make the epistemology explicit. So later, when someone asks, why did we do this? The answer isn't because the email sounded reasonable. Second, judgment moments embedded in workflow. This is the part that most organizations avoid because it feels like slowing down. It does slow down on purpose. A judgment moment is a forced checkpoint where a human must classify intent before the system allows action to proceed. Not reviewed, not looks good, classification. Severity, risk posture, exception approved or denied, escalation required or not, customer impact statement accepted or rejected, change blast radius accepted or rejected. If you can't classify, you can't proceed. This is what turns thinking into accountable movement. It's also what stops Copilot from becoming a narrative engine that quietly drives decisions through momentum. And no, this is not bureaucracy. This is entropy management, because the organization will always drift toward the easiest path. Fast outputs, unclear ownership, and plausible deniability when it fails. Judgment moments are how you make that drift expensive. Third, name decision owners, individuals, not teams. The phrase, "the business decided," is a compliance evasion tactic. So is IT approved it. So is HR said. Teams execute, committees advise, tools propose. Only an individual can be held accountable. So every judgment moment needs a person attached. Their role can be delegated, their decision can be informed by others. But their name is the anchor that stops responsibility from diffusing into the org chart. Now, if you do those three things, here's what changes. AI stops being a magic answer machine and becomes what it actually is, a cognitive surface that generates options. And your organization becomes what it has to be, a place where choices are owned, recorded, and enforced. This is also where the M365 to ServiceNow handoff stops being a vague integration story and becomes a governance mechanism. Copilot produces synthesis and proposed interpretations. Fine, but the only thing that can move an organization is a decision that triggers enforced consequences. That means Copilot output must land in a workflow that contains a judgment moment, a named owner, and a decision log reference. For example, incident triage. Copilot proposes 3 plausible interpretations: credential theft, misconfigured conditional access, or benign automation gone noisy. It provides evidence links. Great. Then the human selects intent, probable credential theft, and selects severity, high. That selection writes the decision owner into the record and forces a rationale field. Now the action system enforces containment steps and approvals. It creates the audit trail. It schedules the post-incident review. It blocks the organization from improvising itself into inconsistency. That's the handoff. Cognition proposes possibilities, judgment selects intent, action enforces consequence. And notice what disappears: the ability to pretend. You can't say the system said so because the system didn't decide. A human did. You can't say nobody approved this because the owner is recorded. You can't say we didn't know because the options and evidence are attached. This is why the prescriptions must be irreversible. They don't teach people to be better. They force the enterprise to behave like it believes its own risk posture matters. You want the simplest test for whether your AI program is real? Pick any AI influence decision from last week and ask, where is the judgment moment, who owned it, and where is the log? If you can't answer in under 60 seconds, you didn't scale capability. You scaled plausible deniability? The future of work, from execution to evaluation. So once you accept the triad, cognition, judgment, action, you also accept the future of work you were trying to avoid. Execution becomes cheap, evaluation becomes expensive. That isn't a slogan. It's the new cost model of knowledge work. Most organizations built their identity around execution. Shipping documents, shipping decks, shipping tickets, shipping updates. They rewarded the person who could produce the artifact fastest because artifacts were expensive. AI collapses that scarcity. The artifact is no longer the proof of work. It's the receipt that work might have happened. And that distinction matters because enterprises don't run on receipts. They run on consequences. So the future looks like this. Meetings stop being places where people create content in real time. AI will do that. Notes, summaries, action items, option lists, draft narratives, done. The meeting becomes the place where someone has to choose what matters, what changes, and what gets enforced, which means the real meeting isn't the calendar invite. The real meeting is the judgment moment embedded in the workflow afterward. That's where the organization either becomes accountable or becomes theatrical. Documents change too. A document is no longer a deliverable. It's a dialogue between cognition and judgment. AI produces drafts. Humans state intent, constraints, and ownership. The value shifts from did we write it to can we defend it. So the writing isn't the work, the reasoning is. And the most uncomfortable shift is for leadership, because leadership has spent years outsourcing reasoning to process, committees, and status reporting. AI makes that outsourcing easier. That's why this episode exists. In the AI era, leaders don't get judged on throughput. Throughput is free. They get judged on decision quality. Decision quality shows up in 3 ways: fewer reversals, fewer surprises, and fewer unowned outcomes. It shows up when incident response has a record, when policy exceptions have a rationale, when changes have an owner, when forecasts trigger actual constraints instead of more slides. And if that sounds like bureaucracy, Good. That's the part you were already living with. The difference is that now bureaucracy is optional and judgment is mandatory. Because if you don't embed judgment into the system, you don't get fast innovation there. You get fast entropy. You get people shipping answer-shaped text into the organization without any enforcement pathway attached and then acting surprised when it becomes doctrine by repetition. This is also where agents become dangerous in a very specific way. Agents will act, they will call APIs, they will execute tasks, they will move data, they will send messages, they will close tickets, they will do all the things your organization currently does slowly and inconsistently. But an agent cannot own the decision that justified the action. So if you scale agents without scaling judgment moments, you don't create autonomy. You create automation without accountability. You create conditional chaos with a nicer user interface. Over time, the organization drifts into a probabilistic operating model. Outputs happen, actions happen, and nobody can explain why. That is not modern work. That is unmanaged delegation. So the only sustainable pattern is this. Cognition proposes, judgment selects, action enforces. And the trick is not building more intelligence. The trick is building operational gravity. Constraints that force a human to declare intent before the system is allowed to move. That is what separates an enterprise that scales trust from an enterprise that scales confusion. Because AI doesn't eliminate work. It relocates it. It moves the effort from make the thing to decide the thing. From write the answer to own the consequences. From produce the artifact to defend the rationale. And if your organization refuses that shift, it will keep buying intelligence and keep suffering the same failures, just faster and with better formatting. Conclusion: the behavior shift. Reintroduce judgment into the system. AI scales whatever you are, clarity or confusion, because it can't own your decisions. If you do one thing after this, stop asking what does the AI say, and start asking who owns this decision. Subscribe, and then go to the next episode on building judgment moments into the M365 ServiceNow operating model.